Добрий вечір, шановна громада. Я називаюся Дагмара Турчин-Дубірак, і я є голова наукового товариства імені Шевченка в Канаді. І я з великою приємністю хочу привітати вас сьогодні на черговій доповіді нашого товариства. З особливою приємністю я хочу привітати нашого шановного доповідача, доктора Томаса Приймака, який буде виступати, як ви бачите, з дуже цікавою доповіддю. І доктор Томас Приймак є дуже давнім членом нашого наукового товариства. І я пам'ятаю, вже багато років ми зустрічаємося на конференціях, на різних симпозіумах, і він так само виступає з дуже цікавими доповідями на нашому товаристві. А крім того, він випустив кілька книжок, і деякі з них були, власне, спонсоровані нашим товариством. Ці книжки є великим внеском до українознавства. Перед тим, як приступимо до представлення доктора Приймака і доповіді, я хочу подякувати всім нашим спонсорам, завдяки яким ми відбуваємо всі ці доповіді в такому чудовому приміщенні в прекрасному Олдені. Перш за все, це BCU Foundation. Дуже дякую їм за приміщення, за те, що вони завжди частують нас смачною кавою і чаєм, і тісточками. Також хочу подякувати нашим медійним спонсорам. Це «Контакт», радіопрограма «Пісні України», «Форум ТВ», «Поступ», українська радіопрограма, «Новий шлях», газета і так само Українському конгресу українських Канади. Отже, до представлення нашого шановного доповідача, доктора Томаса Приймака, я попрошу члена нашої дирекції, магістра Марту Горбань. Прошу.
Дякую, пані Дагмаро. It is an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce tonight's speaker. Thomas M. Prymak, PH.D., is a senior research fellow at the Chair of Ukrainian Studies, Departments of History and Political Science, University of Toronto, with which he has been associated for the past 4 decades. After obtaining his BA and MA degrees at the University of Manitoba, Thomas Prymak completed his doctorate in history at the University of Toronto. Since then, while conducting research in affiliation with the Chair of Ukrainian Studies, he has taught history at the University of Saskatchewan, McMaster University, and the University of Toronto. He has also served in positions with the Multicultural History Society of Ontario and the Journal of Ukrainian Studies. Dr. Prymak is the author of several published books and many articles and reviews in Ukrainian political and cultural history, aspects of Soviet, Russian, and Polish history and Polish-Ukrainian relations, and East European history generally. Especially interested in the personal in history, Dr. Prymak has written several biographical studies and frequently takes a biographical approach. This is apparent in his work on historians Mykhailo Hrushevsky, Dmytro Doroshenko, and Dmytro Yavornitsky. Most notable in this regard is his award-winning biography of the Ukrainian historian and statesman Mykhailo Hrushevsky, the first scholarly biography of this key figure in the history of 20th century Ukraine. Dr. Prymak is also interested in art history and has written about Rembrandt, Jan Matejko, and Ilya Repin. And his interests reach even farther afield. As I list them, consider how striking they are in their breadth. World history, especially East-West contacts, Persian language and culture, religions, especially church history and aspects of Muslim-Christian relations, Central Asian and Middle East history, with a focus on Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan. Early modern and medieval Europe, including late antiquity and the Byzantine Empire, and again in art history, Ukrainian, Polish, and Russian realist painting, and the Orientalist painters of the 19th century. To return closer to home, Dr. PRYMAK has also written on Ukrainian-Canadian history. His articles in this area address a wide range of topics, including the clash between Canadian Prime Minister John Diefenbaker and Nikita Khrushchev at the United Nations General Assembly in New York City in September-October 1960, the Soviet assassination of Yevhen Konovalets in Rotterdam in 1938, and its impact on the life and work of French-Canadian writer Gabriel Roy, and the role of Ivan Franko in promoting the first great immigration of Ukrainians to Canada in 1896. It is Dr. PRYMAK's research in Canadian and Ukrainian history that provides the foundation for his lecture this evening, Canadian Ethnic Politics and Canada's Policy Towards the USSR's Ukrainian Question. The lecture, like my introduction, will be delivered in English. However, questions following the lecture may be posed in English or Ukrainian. Please join me in welcoming Dr. PRYMAK.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for those very kind introductions, both of you. Ladies and gentlemen, this evening I will be talking about Canadian foreign policy, and in particular, Canadian policy towards the USSR's Ukrainian question, so towards the USSR. And around this central theme, I will try to wrap the entire history of the Ukrainians in Canada. No simple job, but I'll try it and we'll see what we come up with. So I've simplified the title a little bit this evening to Ukrainian-Canadian History and Canada's Foreign Policy. Now, I'm going to, for the most part, speak extemporaneously about these slides. I put together a series of slides for you that bring this subject somewhat alive. And there are people in the audience, I'm sure, who lived through some of these events and remember them quite keenly. So this is a map of Ukraine in the 19th century. Ukraine did not appear on very many maps of Europe in those days. It did appear on a few maps of the Slavonic world, with the Ukrainians listed as speaking the Middle Russian dialect, Maloruski. And within the Austrian Empire, the western part that was under the Austrians during the 19th century, Halechina or Galicia, and Bukovina to the south, they were called Ruthenians. So that's the 19th century. Now, most of the Ruthenians in Canada at that time originated in the crown land of Galicia in the Austrian Empire. And they didn't come from all over Galicia. They came from one specific area within Galicia, about 90% of them. And I don't have a pointer, so I'm going to do it by hand. This particular corner is where they came from, between the town of Husiatan up here and Zalishchike on the Dniester River down here. So all of this area, Chortkiv, and all these other towns in that area. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that in 1895, 96, Ussr'S at an educational institute in Lviv contacted the Canadian government about possible immigration to Canada from this area. Canada was advertising across Europe for settlers. He saw it and he picked it up and he promoted it. And who should help him? None other than Ivan Franko. And Ivan Franko's friend, Kirill Genik, close friend and compatriot and a political sympathizer, accompanied the first group, large group of several hundred Ukrainians to Canada in the year 1896. So they were known in Canada as Galicians, whether they came from Bukovina to the south, right adjacent to that area, or not. They were known as Galicians. And they, of course, called themselves Ruski or Rusin. And this was translated into English as Ruthene or Ruthenian. Now, I wanted to put something personal into this subject because that's my own origin with this pioneer immigration. And this is a good document to show what's going on there. It's my grandfather's passport. It was issued just on the eve of coming to Canada. And you can see it's dated April 10th, 1910. April 8th, 1910 on the last page. The first page, it says, in the name of His Majesty Franz Joseph I, and tells where he comes from, that same area, Koszalice, near the town of Zaliszczyce in Galicia in Germany. And it's good for 3 years, 3 Jahre. Now, not everybody came with passports because it was not required to have a passport before the First World War. But he did, and a few others did as well. And where did they settle? They settled in these empty lands along the railroad, the northern rim of the prairie, in this great arc, from this southern corner going upward through Dauphin, Yorkton, Saskatoon, Edmonton, and way up north there you see the Peace River country. That's where Chrystia Freeland's people come from. So that's the Ukrainian settlements as depicted on a map in the Encyclopedia of Ukraine in 1971. Now, right off the start, there were troubles. And the trouble was the First World War. The First World War breaks out in 1914. And Russia, Serbia are at war with Austria. Germany enters the war. There were about 170,000 Ruthenians on the prairies in those days that had come to Canada and began to have children and whatnot, and were expanding their population. And in 1912, a bishopric was founded in Canada, and this man, Nikita Budka, was appointed bishop by Metropolitan Sheptytsky. And you can see here, and I'll just read it, the Greek Catholic Ruthenians in Canada got a bishop of their own in 1912. Budka was a dedicated pastor, but a poor administrator, who upon the outbreak of war in 1914, declared that his flock should remain loyal to their Austrian sovereign in Europe, but quickly had to reverse this position when the British Empire, and Canada was part of it, entered the war on the opposite side. This caused great embarrassment to both his church and his faithful, and it gave ammunition to the critics of Ruthenian immigration to Canada and fed into the wartime hysteria of that time. There followed a series of terrible actions against the Galician settlers. Large numbers were deprived of citizenship rights. Some of them were interned in what are sometimes called concentration camps. There were certainly camps of some sort, and forced to do labor. These were mostly people who were perfectly innocent of politics, people who were unemployed, indigent, that sort of thing. Also people who were trying to go to the United States to find work. The United States had not yet entered the war, it was neutral, but they were arrested and put in camps because of that. And this has been publicized by my colleague, Professor Ussr'S, whom you have probably heard of. And finally, in 1916, the bilingual Ruthenian English education system was suppressed. This had a very powerful effect upon Ukrainian-Canadian history because it meant that the language would not be passed on to further generations. So the first generation, the immigrant generation, retained the language. The second generation got some of the language from their parents, but they were already beginning to be surrounded by an English milieu. The third generation, in general, did not learn the Ukrainian language. Had the Ruthenian English education system still existed, and existed to the present, there'd be larger numbers of of Ukrainian speakers in Western Canada, which there weren't before 1991. They're largely absorbed and assimilated to English Canadian culture. There would have been positions for them, there would have been school teachers required, there would have been jobs, and the culture would have developed in a different way, but it didn't, and all because of the war. Now the war comes to an end in 1918, and revolution breaks out a year before that in Russia, and Ukraine eventually declares itself autonomous, then a republic, and eventually independence in the beginning of 1918. And the first president of independent Ukraine, autonomous and then independent Ukraine, is Mykhailo Hrushevsky. Now, this is the first time that Ukraine really makes the headlines all over Europe. An independent Ukrainian state, conflict with Bolshevik Russia, the Germans active in some ways, other people interfering in Ukrainian affairs. Finally, there's foreign interference, and the French and the British land in Odessa, all this sort of thing. So it's in the news every day. And who explains who the Ukrainians are? Mykhailo Hrushevsky, the historian. He writes this pamphlet, "Хто такі українці, чого вони хочуть?" Okay, who are the Ukrainians and what do they want? And he has to explain to them because they don't know. And Arnold Toynbee in London, who is working on intelligence for the British, writes an article about this and said, where did these people come from? 30 million Ukrainians, and we've never heard of them before. So this is news for Europe. But he popularized the name, very, very important, because that name begins to catch on very, very quickly. And people in Canada stop calling themselves Ruthenians and begin to call themselves Ukrainians. And along with that new name comes a new national consciousness and all of that sort of thing. Now the war ends, the same area is transferred. There's a war between the Ukrainians and the Poles. The Poles are better equipped. They win the war. The Ukrainians have to withdraw. They form a government in exile in Vienna. But this area, still there, occupying from Volyn here, west to here, and south to there. About 1/4 of the territory of the new Polish state, the Republic of Poland, is occupied by Ukrainians, largely by Ukrainians, not completely, but largely by Ukrainian population. And there's disputes between various geographers as to what the percentages are. But there's an awful lot of Ukrainians there, and they're discontented. Why are they discontented? Because when the war ended by 1923, all of Europe knew there was some kind of dispute going on. There was a conference of the international ambassadors of the Allied powers, and at the conference of 1923, the Polish government guaranteed that there would be a referendum and autonomy would be given to the Ukrainians of Galicia. It never happened. They were never given autonomy. They were never there. In fact, some of the rights that they had, some of the schools they had were closed down, they were Polonized, that sort of thing. And a very ferocious Polish-Ukrainian conflict emerged. Now, this reached Canada. There were a number of things that were going on during this interwar period, and I'll just very briefly outline them. The first one was the continued immigration of Ukrainians from that area. This is the second wave of Ukrainian immigrations, and they came largely from Poland, which is not just Galicia now, but also Volyn. Western Volyn is under the Poles. They're coming from Volyn too. They're better educated than the first wave, and they have a national consciousness, largely. Now, in 1928, the Ku Klux Klan comes to Canada. It's very strong in Western Canada, believe it or not, especially in the province of Saskatchewan. In the province of Saskatchewan in 1928, the Anglican bishop gives a speech in which he, and is published, in which he attacks the Galicians in Canada and accusing them of having a lower level of civilization and all that same sort of thing, everything that goes with it. So we have by that time one member of the federal parliament, and that's this gentleman here, Mykhailo Hrushevsky, Canada's first MP of Ukrainian background. Served from 1926 to 1935, he defended Ukrainian origin Canadians from the attacks of radical Canadian nativists, that's what we politely call them, and exposed suppression of Ukrainian rights during the Polish government pacification actions of 1930. And this is news all over Europe as well. And his speech in Parliament, he made two big speeches, one on this response to Lloyd, and the other about Poland and Polish oppression of the Ukrainians. The speech actually affects the Prime Minister, who was very touched by it. But most of all, it attracted the attention of J.S. Wordsworth. J.S. Wordsworth was the founder, practically, of the CCF, the predecessor of the NDP. And he was a Protestant minister favorable to the social gospel, you know, with a conscience about the poor and the oppressed and all that sort of thing. And he went to Europe, and I believe he spoke about it in Europe, and he investigated the matter and all that. And that's because of Hrushevsky. Towards the end of the year, we'll stay there for a second. Towards the end of the interwar period, there's one very important incident I discovered in the archives in Ottawa. The Poles found out in 1938 that Alexander Sushko, one of the leaders of the OUN, was visiting Canada, making a tour of Canada, and especially of the various UNO, Ukrainian National Federation halls across the country, gathering money for the cause. The Poles found out about it. They felt that he was gathering money to support terrorism against the Poles, you know, in revenge for the pacification and that sort of thing. And they complained to Ottawa, and they said, this man is wanted for murder in Poland, and he should not be allowed in Canada. And what did Mackenzie King do? Nothing. He said, according to the Ambassador's Agreement of 1923, you are supposed to grant the Ukrainians in Galicia autonomy, and you didn't do it, and this is what you've got. So that was the end of the matter. And that's in 1938, just on the eve of the war, the Second War. And then in 39, the war breaks out. Now, we all know the outline of this. There's the Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggression pact between Stalin and Hitler, who are now uneasy allies, surprising allies against the Republic of Poland. And what was the situation in Canada? Well, Hitler and Stalin were allies. The UNO and the nationalists and other people too felt that the Soviet Union was their primary enemy. So they could support the war, and they did, with some difficulties, because between the wars, UNO had some sympathy for Germany and for Hitler even, as late as 1938. But in 1939, the summer of 1939, the head of UNO goes, and his name was Kossar, some of you might remember him. He goes to Europe on a trip to investigate the matter. And he meets with Canadian officials and British officials across the continent. I think he had contact with British intelligence. He certainly had contact with Canadian intelligence, the RCMP. And he comes back and he makes a report. And he says, gives the general situation. And he says that Canada, the UNO, the UNF will remain loyal to Canada, and then the war breaks out. So the UNF does remain loyal to Canada. Nobody is interned from the UNF. But what happens to the communists? Exactly the opposite. The communists are not willing to support, to fight against the Soviet Union. They say no. The result is the government clamps down on them, and the Ukrainian Canadian labor temple organization is suppressed. Their halls are confiscated, their leaders are interned. So the first part of the war is favorable to the nationalists, but very unfavorable to the communists. And in November of 1940, during this first period, there's government pressure on the various Ukrainian organizations who were really at their throats in the 1930s. You know, the SUS and the UNO really were considered each other deadly enemies. But the government pushed both sides to get together, but it did it quietly and behind the scenes. And Vladimir K. Kiselevsky was crucial in this, because he worked with both of them. And he was basically a government agent. And Professor Simpson of the University of Saskatchewan was the same. They all wanted the Ukrainians to unite behind Canada in the war effort. And so the KUK is founded in Winnipeg at that time. And there in the center, you see the two crucial figures in KUK, Vasil Kushnir, the very prominent churchman of the Ruthenian Catholic Church, as it was called. And next to him, Savchuk, the most influential churchman in the Orthodox, Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So that's the origin of KUK, very political. Now everything changes again, completely changes, at 6 o'clock in the morning on June 22nd, 1941, with the launching of Operation Barbarossa, a surprise German attack on the Soviet Union. And within a few days, Kanadiyski Farmer, which is the largest circulation Ukrainian newspaper in Canada at that time, perhaps with the exception of the Labor Temple paper. But at this time, that was suppressed. So this was probably the most widely read newspaper in Canada. Publishes this news about the outbreak of the war, and you can read it in Ukrainian, Roseysko Niemiecka Vina. And you can see that this is a difficult thing for the editor of Kanadiyski Farmer, too. The editor was very supportive of the Hetman movement, very conservative, and a little bit favorable to the Germans. And here he has to remain loyal to the Allies, loyal to the Dominion of Canada. So what does he do? He puts Hitler up at the top in the corner there. He puts Timoshenko here. He's the general in charge of the Red Army at the time, in the middle. Molotov down there, foreign minister of the Soviet Union. And Stalin right at the bottom. So there you got it. Now this gentleman, I think his name was Hetman actually, didn't last long. The paper was actually owned by a Czech fellow by the name of Dojacek, Frank Dojacek. And he didn't want to have anything to do with this. And he was afraid his newspaper would be closed down if he left this guy in charge. So he fired him. And there's an RCMP report about it, a secret report that I discovered way, way back in the 1980s. And I discuss it in my book on the Ukrainian Canadians in the Second World War. Now, after the German attack on the Soviet Union, the situation of the nationalists became very, very difficult. It was not allowed to criticize the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin was Uncle Joe. He was our ally, fighting valiantly against Hitler. And so they had to deal with this difficult situation. And how did they deal with it? Well, what they did is they transferred most of their efforts from politics, which they couldn't talk about objectively from their point of view, and they put them into culture. And in 1944, Ussr'S was formed in Winnipeg. This was the origin of Ussr'S. It was founded by the UNF, by UNO, as a substitute for politics. And they could do something for the national cause. They could talk about things Ukrainian. But as long as they didn't criticize the Soviet Union, they could get by. And so this was their tactic. And that lasted through the end of the war, right until the end of the war. And Ussr'S today is actually a very rich cultural center. You know, it's a museum, it's a library, it's an archive, it's an art gallery, all of those things. You can see it's several stories high. Now, the prime ministers of this time were William W.L. Mackenzie King and Louis Saint Laurent. Mackenzie King was liberal, and Saint Laurent was liberal as well. Now the war ended. At the same time the war ended, the Guzenko crisis broke out. But before that, King was faced with a difficult situation as well. In 1942, there was a conscription plebiscite held in Canada because the French basically didn't want to serve the British Empire. The English Canadians were gung-ho on conscription. And the French didn't want to see their boys sent off to die for the empire. So Mackenzie King came up with this alternative called conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription. So, and what happened to the Ukrainians? Well, the Ukrainian boys were out fighting with the rest of the Canadians. You know, they volunteered, they were, enthusiastic about the war, the younger ones, but their parents were not. Their parents were back home, and they didn't want to see their boys killed overseas, not in Europe and not in the Far East, because remember, Japan was already at war with us as well. So they didn't want to have anything to do with it. They voted no with the French. So, and I interviewed several Ukrainian Canadian veterans at that time, and they had no idea that their parents had voted no. They were abroad, they knew nothing about it. So, and everything was censored because there was wartime censorship. So anyhow, that's Mackenzie King. And as far as Guzenko goes, most of you have heard of this. Guzenko was a cipher clerk at the Soviet Embassy in Ottawa. And defected with all the papers he could carry. He went to the Canadian government office, I think it was the immigration office, and said, look, I've got this and I'm defecting and I want to come to your side and your government is really interested in this. And they said, oh no, you're in the wrong hospital. We can't help you. And he said, but my life is at stake and my family. And they said, no, we can't help you. So he went to another office. There they gave him some shelter, and the matter went up to the Prime Minister, Mackenzie King. Mackenzie King reads this and he can't believe it. Our ally has betrayed us and is spying on us. He says, no, I don't want to have anything to do with this either. But his underlings, the Deputy Foreign Minister and the Deputy, I forget his name, the second tier officials, not the ministers, but the second tier officials know this is important stuff. And they inform the British and they inform the Americans right away. Right away, the British and the Americans react, and Guzenko is given shelter, protection, and spy rings are discovered, people are arrested, and it turns out the Soviets were out to get the atomic secrets by that time, and there were a number of trials because of it. Communist agents were discovered in Canada, even in the Parliament of Canada, in the United States through the famous Rosenberg trials. So it's a very important event, and many historians believe it's the first sign of the outbreak of the Cold War. And I also met some elderly Ukrainians here in Toronto in the 1980s who knew Guzenko personally and who claimed that he was not Russian but Ukrainian. In all of his biographies it says he was Russian, he has a Ukrainian sounding name, everybody knows that. And so there's some mystery about his ultimate background. But he was born in Russia, and most people say he considered himself to be Russian. So Mackenzie King retires, and Saint Laurent takes over. Saint Laurent does three important things regarding the Ukrainians in Canada. Firstly, he carries on Mackenzie King's open door policy towards displaced persons in Europe, the famous EPs. There were about 175,000 EPs came to Canada at that time, of which about 30 to 35,000 were ethnic Ukrainians. And Saint Laurent is responsible for letting them in. Secondly, the Korean War follows right on the heels of the Guzenko case. Relations with the Soviet Union just get worse. He also appointed the first senator of Ukrainian background, William Wall. Saint Laurent was a very devout Catholic, and Wall was the head of the Bratstvo, the Catholic Bratstvo. So that's Wall. And Saint Laurent also went to church, to the Ukrainian church in Winnipeg, St. Vladimir and Olga's. There's a person in this room who remembers that affair and remembers how important it was and how it affected the Ukrainians in Canada. It had a very powerful influence. And that's the church as it appears today. St. Vladimir, Olga, Ukrainian Catholic Church. And you have to remember, in those days, how often did Roman Catholics attend an Eastern Rite church? It was very unusual, especially for a prime minister. And I think that's the first time that happened. Saint Laurent loses the election to a newcomer from Western Canada, John G. Diefenbaker. Diefenbaker grew up among Ukrainians in Western Canada. He knew them well. He was of partly German ancestry, had a German name, was discriminated against in the 1920s because of his German-sounding name. He was called the Hun. He had this thrown at him at a conservative convention at that time. So he was concerned about discrimination and that sort of thing. He volunteered during the First World War, but never saw combat, came back to Canada, became a lawyer, and opened a practice near this little town called Walkoff, Saskatchewan, right in the middle of that belt that I told you about earlier. Diefenbaker is the third man in the second row, the third man from the left. Some of you might recognize him. That's John Diefenbaker. So when Diefenbaker is elected, the first thing he does is work out a Bill of Rights, a Canadian Bill of Rights, which will prohibit discrimination on the basis of ethnic, national, or religious origin. Now, this was a big thing for those days because prejudice against various minorities was very, very strong. And Diefenbaker opposed it. He was sympathetic to these minorities. He was generally had the reputation of standing with the underdog. So he liked to stand for the common folk. He fought for the teaching of French in Saskatchewan schools. He gave Native Canadian Indians, as they were called, the vote. They were not allowed to vote for that before that time, and he gave them the vote. He passed his Canadian Bill of Rights prohibiting discrimination, and he defended the Ukrainians at the United Nations in New York City. Now here we have a cartoon. I just stuck this in this afternoon. And it's from Komar, Ukrainian magazine here in Canada. It was published in Winnipeg, actually, by Titor, a famous publisher from Lviv. And I think this cartoon was probably done by Levitsky, by Miron Levitsky. I'm not sure, but I think he was their cartoonist for a while. And it shows Soviet elections. And there are all the candidates, and you notice they all have mustaches, and they all look exactly like Uncle Joe. And here this fellow is telling the Ukrainian here, he's dressed in the Ukrainian costume, although with lots of patches, the guard standing next to him, well, you can vote for anyone you want. So that's mocking Soviet elections. This is important for what follows. With the death of Stalin, there's a power struggle. And Lavrenti Beria, the head of the NKVD, makes a play for power, holding out hope to the non-Russian nationalities that they'll be given more rights and more power. But he's outmaneuvered by the head of the Ukrainian party, Mykhailo Hrushevsky, whom you've all heard of. And Beria loses the battle. What happens is that Khrushchev makes an alliance with Zhukov, General Zhukov, who is a war hero. The two of them show up at a Politburo meeting with some of military people before various guards could come. The result is they whisked him off, they took over, voted him out of office, and a couple of months later he was executed. Khrushchev takes over. Now, Khrushchev initiated a number of important reforms. He let a lot of people out of the Gulag. I met the children of some of them here in Toronto and interviewed them. They were let out in the 1960s and returned to Halichinau. And but at the same time, in the 30s, Hrushchev was a pretty nasty fellow, and he did a lot of dirty work for Stalin. So he had these two sides to him. But he seemed to be better in the 1960s than he was in the 1930s. And in 1960, in early 1960, an American spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union, the famous U-2 incident. And the Soviets announced that they had shot down the American plane, and what are the Americans doing, spying on us? They shouldn't be in our airspace. This is going to cause a war. And President Eisenhower said, no, it's not. We didn't spy on you. We didn't do anything. And then the next day or two, suddenly there's Gary Powers on Soviet television, prisoner, the pilot of the plane. And Eisenhower is thoroughly embarrassed, but he has to stand his ground. So that causes huge international crisis. There's fears that another war will break out. And there's a meeting in France, I believe in Paris, and Khrushchev closes this topic, gets very angry at the West, and the whole meeting breaks down. And the only thing that they manage to agree on is that they'll meet again in New York City at the United Nations in September of 1960. So at the United Nations, Khrushchev makes a very fiery speech accusing the West of all kinds of things. Spying on the Soviets, of course, but also promoting colonialism and imperialism throughout the world and oppressing people throughout the world. Now, this is a tactic. This is a tactic as well as ideology. There are people in the United Nations by this time who are from the third world. India gets this independence, Indonesia gets this independence, and they have representatives there. They have people of the United Nations. They can vote. And Khrushchev's program and tactic is to get them on the communist side and gang up on the West. So what happens is that Eisenhower has already spoken, and he's old, and he's going to retire, and he has a bad heart, and he doesn't want to talk again. So he's not going to respond. Macmillan is the next logical choice, but he's still in England. He hasn't arrived in New York yet. So it falls to the next speaker from the West, the next important speakers from the West, to reply to Khrushchev's speech attacking the West for colonialism and imperialism. And that person is John G. Diefenbaker, sympathetic to Ukrainians. Diefenbaker in particular is a good friend, or I should put it the other way, Father Kushner, that fellow from 1940 that you saw in the picture there, is still in 1960 the head of Cook. He's a very influential member of Cook, the president of Cook. And the newcomers, the DPs, don't quite get him. And they accuse him of various things. Perhaps he doesn't handle them that well, I don't know. But he's a target of Komar as well. And they make fun of him, saying he's a Democrat and an ascetic. Well, he was anything but an ascetic. He was known for his love of luxury. And he had a housekeeper, and they say he had a son and all this sort of thing. And so they were making fun of him. But he was an important man. And he talked to Diefenbaker, and he said, look, you've got to talk about us. This is an important question. It's a weakness of the Soviet Union. The national question is their biggest weakness. And you've got to talk about it. And this is a way of replying to him when you speak at the United Nations. Well, Diefenbaker doesn't. Diefenbaker at the United Nations, and he addresses the United Nations. And he makes the point about Britain having liberated, given independence and a democratic governance to 14 of its former colonies between 1945 and 1960. 14, and there are more on the way. So that's one thing. And then he says, addressing Khrushchev directly, he says, we're doing this, what are you doing? You're suppressing the Hungarians, and we know it in 1956. You're suppressing the Lithuanians, the Latvians, and Estonians. You're suppressing, quote, the freedom-loving Ukrainians. Well, this is just wonderful for the Ukrainians in Canada and for the Ukrainians in the United States. Somebody is finally talking about them and giving their point of view. And Diefenbaker becomes a great hero for the Ukrainians in Canada and in the United States as well. It's even filters across the Soviet Union into the Gulag. And Metropolitan, or secretly Bishop Slipe hears about it inside the Gulag. There's rumors about what Diefenbaker said in the United Nations. And he says this was the greatest moment, the greatest hope we had of those days was Diefenbaker's speech at the United Nations in September 1960. Well, the problem with Diefenbaker's speech was it occurred on the very same day that Nixon debated Kennedy on American television. So American attention was riveted on the Nixon-Kennedy debate. Nobody paid attention to Diefenbaker except, you know, the Ukrainian weeklies, Svoboda, Novy Shlach, and the Ukrainian newspapers. Okay? So that was a problem. Also, Khrushchev was not present. He boycotted the speech. His deputy, Foreign Minister Gromyko, boycotted the speech. Where did they go? To a luncheon with Cyrus Eaton. Cyrus Eaton was very a peacenik. He was a Bernard Russell peacenik type. And he was, the previous year, had been awarded the Stalin Prize for Peace. Or not Stalin Prize, but the Soviet Prize for Peace. So they had lunch with him, and they did not attend Diefenbaker's speech. But somebody did. There was a deputy foreign minister who was there, and he walked out in the middle of it. So it was quite a deal. It was quite a deal. And if you read the United Nations transcripts, as I did, it's quite interesting. So what happens to Diefenbaker and Khrushchev after the speech? Well, Diefenbaker goes crazy, or rather, Khrushchev goes crazy. Why? His wife is Ukrainian. He's trying to help Ukrainians, in his view. He's friendly to Ukrainians. On the boat on the way to New York, he says to Shevchenko, I forget his first name, but he was a diplomat who defected to the West and wrote his memoirs. He says to this Shevchenko, "Oh, are you related to the great poet?" And he says, "No, I'm not, but I'm Ukrainian." And Diefenbaker and Khrushchev says, "It's good. It's good that you're proud of your nationality." So there's something there, right? And it affects him emotionally. It affects him very deeply. And he goes crazy, basically. He shouts and he pounds his desk. And he is basically does not accept these accusations of Diefenbaker, who openly defended the freedom of Ukraine, you see. And he asks the head of the Ukrainian Soviet delegation to the United Nations, Mykhailo Hrushevsky, or in Ukrainian, Mykhailo Hrushevsky, to reply to Diefenbaker. And Hrushevsky does this. He replies to Diefenbaker. And he says that, that you're posing as the liberator of the Ukrainian people, but you're a false liberator. You're not a real liberator. And he defends the Soviet Union right down the line. And he suggests as well that the Labor Temple people in Canada be an intermediary between the government of the Soviet Union and the government of Canada. What happens? The Canadians totally ignore this speech. The press totally ignores this speech. Everybody ignores this speech except the Labor Temple press in Canada. You can find it in both papers. Ukrainsky Slovo and Ukrainsky Zhitchak both publish it in full, with lots of comments and protests against Diefenbaker. And Khrushchev also ordered Hrushevsky to, and also I think his name was Mazurov, the head of the Belarusian delegation, to deliver speeches in their own national languages against Diefenbaker and defending the Soviet Union and the Soviet federal system. Well, the Belarusian chap doesn't even know the language, and he can't do it. So everything falls on PH.D. He does it. He can speak Ukrainian. He speaks Ukrainian for the first time in the history of the United Nations. He speaks in the Ukrainian language from the podium of the UN to the whole world. So it's an achievement of sorts. Totally ignored by the nationalist press in Canada and the States, and by other nations as well. Everybody knows, except the Labour Temple. And they accept it as a kind of a bit true. So that's PTND. Now, within a few years, the Vietnam War breaks out, but Diefenbaker is out of power. We have a new Prime Minister, Lester B. Pearson. Lester B. Pearson is famous for his activities in diplomacy. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for arranging a ceasefire between Egypt and Israel in 1956. And he goes back into, he's in Canadian diplomatic service, and then he tries to keep out of conflicts generally. Vietnam breaks out, in 1968 it gets really bad. There's the Gulf of Tonkin incident. There are soon 500,000 American soldiers in South Vietnam fighting. It's a big deal. Canada stays out of it. Canada stays out of it because of Pearson, because he received the Nobel Prize. There's some parallels with today. Just as he wanted to stay out of Vietnam, so Chrétien wanted to stay out of Iraq, right? Maybe it was an American interest, but the Canadians thought it was a bad idea. Well, same thing at that time. Pearson thought it was a bad idea to get involved in a war on the Asian continent. And he wouldn't have anything to do with it. The result is Canada has good relations, relatively good relations with the Soviet Union, and who won the competition to get the World's Fair in 1967. They actually won the competition, but they withdrew at the last moment, citing security concerns and financial concerns. So Canada steps up and does the job. The World's Fair is held in Montreal. It's called Expo 67. The Soviet and the American exhibits are among the biggest, aside from the Canadian ones, which are very big, including the provinces. But the two, there's a competition sort of between the Soviets and the Americans at this time. And the Soviets fill up their pavilion with all kinds of things, all kinds of mechanical things that they've invented, and especially Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin and the space race. That is a main theme. The Americans reply, and if you go first to one and then the other, you'll see the same thing, the space race in the American pavilion as well. So the Soviets are surprisingly good. They have a surprisingly good exhibit. But the Americans have a spectacular design for their pavilion. It's very, very impressive. So there's that competition going on. So the three best and most visited pavilions are the Soviet, the American, and the Canadian. At the same time, the same year, Charles de Gaulle comes to Canada. And he addresses the national question in Canada, which is getting worse and worse and worse. There are bombs placed in post boxes during Diefenbaker's time. Diefenbaker doesn't know how to handle it. And this gets pretty severe. And Pearson calls a commission, a royal commission. That's what Canadians do. There's a difficult question. You call a commission to look into the affair. So there's a royal commission, and to this royal commission is appointed J.B. Hrushevsky, a linguist, a Ukrainian linguist from Winnipeg, Yaroslav Hrushevsky. And they file a report, comes out volume after volume. There's, I believe, 6 volumes, 4 really big fat ones. The 4th volume has to do with other ethnic groups, not English, not French. And the word multiculturalism comes up. Probably because Senator Paul Music was pushing for something called multiculturalism. And this was adopted by the Commission and outlined in its report. Now, towards the end of his tenure, Pearson brings 3 important French Canadians into the federal cabinet. The most important of them all is Pierre Elliott Trudeau, this gentleman. He wins the election first in the Liberal Convention, the National Convention, which is very contested. And then afterwards, he wins the general election, becomes Prime Minister. He acts immediately on the French-Canadian file, works for bilingualism in the federal civil service, and pushes the province to do the same within theirs, but he can't, of course, it's provincial jurisdiction. Still, Ontario moves somewhat in that direction. Protection for minority schools outside of Quebec, French minority schools, that sort of thing. But what does he do for the others? The entire 4th volume is about the other ethnic groups, and he moves very, very slowly on that. Some people think he didn't move at all the first 2 years. But there's a crisis, and it just seems to get worse and worse. In 1970, there's the October crisis in Quebec. Provincial Minister Pierre Laporte is murdered by a separatist group, terrorist group. The British Trade Commissioner, James Cross, is kidnapped. And the government of Quebec is very, very shaky. There's talk about a provisional government replacing the government of Bourassa, who was the premier at the time. So it's a very shaky situation. The feds step in. Trudeau steps in with his famous phrase, "Just watch me." And he declares the War Measures Act, martial law in the province of Quebec. And stabilizes the situation. The terrorists fly off to Cuba, Cross is released, and things die down a little bit. But one of Trudeau's major objectives was to improve Canada's relations with the rest of the world outside of Britain and the United States. So better relations with the new countries in Africa, the French-speaking countries in Africa, better relations with China, better relations with the Soviet Union, the communist bloc. Okay. Now the Ukrainians don't like this. The Ukrainians in Canada don't like this. You know, what are you doing talking about friends with the Soviet Union when, you know, we're offering them things, and what are they offering us? Nothing. So they want something in return. So it's a political issue, and it's discussed on the pages of the Ukrainian newspapers in Canada, in particular Novy Shlach and Ukrainsky Holos in Winnipeg, which is very, it was a liberal paper basically, but it was it's very supportive. All the papers are very supportive of the idea of multiculturalism. Well, things died down by 1971. Finally, Trudeau can move on this international file. He does improve relations with the Soviet Union. Remember, in 1968, the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia. He couldn't do anything in 68. Then in 1970, the October crisis, he couldn't do anything in 70. But in 1971, he doesn't waste any time at all, and he tries to warm up relations with the Soviet Union, and he arranges to go on a tour of the Soviet Union. Not just Moscow, but Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kiev, Tashkent in Central Asia and the North. All of these places. Makes a tour of the Soviet Union. This is the beginning of the tour in Moscow. You see Pierre Trudeau in this corner. Sitting next to him is Walter Deakin, Member of Parliament from Toronto, this part of Toronto. Across from him is Alexei Kosygin, the Premier of the Soviet Union. Next to him, I'm not quite sure who that is or the next person, but the fourth one is Gromyko, the Foreign Minister of the Soviet Union. He's been around for a long, long time. And they're sitting behind Deakin. You can see a picture of Karl Marx on the wall. You can't see it, but behind Trudeau, there's a picture of Lenin. And Trudeau has, this is a black and white picture, but if you saw it in color, you'll see that he has a red rose in his lapel. Okay? So this is, and they've got all smiles on their faces. They're making deals. And what are they making a deal on? Exchanges. Scholarly exchanges, educational exchanges, scientific exchanges, cultural exchanges generally, and sports exchanges. Okay, these are all discussed in Moscow. The atmosphere in Moscow is very official. You know, it's good, but it's very official, and there are no big crowds or anything greeting him. And then he flies off to Kiev. And there he is with his new bride. And you can see she's wearing a huska as we used to say. And I think there might be some purpose in this. She wants to make a contact with the Ukrainian people. And certainly Trudeau did. Margaret was really not very political. She was representative of Western youth. She was about 25 years younger than Trudeau. And the Soviets were very taken by her, very taken by her. They had never seen a national leader like this with a young woman touring before. And they were very impressed, and they complimented him on it many times. So here they are arriving. It's springtime in Kiev, beautiful weather. He's warmly welcomed. And there are meetings. There's a banquet held in his honor, in which he says that Canada can learn from the way the Soviet Union operates. It can learn how to deal with the national question in Canada and federalism in Canada by studying the Soviet model. Well, you can imagine how this goes over with Novy Shlak and the Ukrainians in Canada. It doesn't go over at all. There's an uproar. And the newspaperman, one of the newspapermen with the Prime Minister, a Canadian newspaperman named Charles Mitch, publishes an article. It's in the Southern chain, distributed across the country, saying that never before had a Canadian Prime Minister ever spoken so highly of the Soviet Union. So that's Trudeau. When he's there, he had been asked by the Ukrainians in Canada, in particular by Cook, to speak to the Soviets about the political prisoners. This is the era of the Shestasatniki, you know, the people who were protesting for more freedom, not always political, but certainly cultural. And they wanted Canada to help somehow publicize the cause and maybe alleviate conditions and release some of these people. Trudeau wouldn't publicly agree to it, but his companion, Deacon from Toronto, did. And he approached Ussr'S, who was the Soviet contact in charge of Soviet Ukraine. Not Sheles. Remember, there's two of them at this time. There's Sheles, who's the head of the party, and Ussr'S, who's the head of the government. Trudeau is a foreign visitor. He meets Ussr'S, not Sheles. And Ussr'S reacts very strongly against this. Okay, so they get nowhere. When he gets back to Canada, he's criticized for this. Trudeau is criticized for this. There is, all the newspapers are filled with this sort of thing. In Parliament, there's a debate, and the Conservative opposition criticizing him for not defending the dissidents in the Soviet Union. He stands up in Parliament and he says, well, if I defend Soviet dissidents over there, especially nationalist dissidents, they'll just accuse me of imprisoning FLQ prisoners here in Canada. You know, they'll say, well, why can't we do it if you do it? You know, saying the two things are equal. Well, this causes enormous consternation and opposition in all of the more informed sections of Canadian society. There's much to do about it. And moreover, when Trudeau was visiting the Soviet North, he praised the Soviets for developing the North, especially the city of Norilsk. And what is Norilsk? It's a city that was built in the North with the slave labor of the Gulag prisoners. And exactly 2 decades before Trudeau said this, there was a massive strike in Norilsk in which many, many hundreds of prisoners were shot to death by the Soviet guards. And this happened in that exact city that Trudeau was talking about. So it's a big to-do. The Ukrainians in Canada are mad as hell, and they require some kind of pacifying because Kosygin is on his way to Canada for the return business. So he meets them in the summer of 1971, and there he is with Kushner, Father Kushner, and they have a meeting. And after the meeting, there's some pictures taken, and then the priest, the press asked Kushner, well, what happened at your meeting? And did the Prime Minister apologize or what? And Kushner doesn't know what to say because Trudeau had told him, well, I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings, but that's my opinion. That's my opinion. And I stand my ground. And so anyhow, Kushner doesn't know what to say to him. So they turn to Anthony Yaramovich, another delegate from Winnipeg. And they asked Yaramovich the same thing. Well, what did the Prime Minister say? Did he apologize? And Yaramovich is the same. He sort of study, doesn't know quite what to say. And then a third man steps up to the microphone. He says, he was a delegate from Toronto, a lawyer from Toronto. And he said, oh yes, the Prime Minister apologized. He apologized and we accept his apology and everything is fine now. And this is the story that goes out to the rest of the world. And recently I was sent from Kiev a KGB report on this particular meeting, and it said it accepted the story too. So the KGB believed it the same as everybody else. Everybody was fooled basically, except one person in this room knew what would happen, and he testified as to what happened. So, and I'll leave you to guess who that is. So that's the summer of 1971. Now, Kosygin is supposed to come to Canada in October 1971. Trudeau speaks to Parliament on October 7th, 1971, and decides to link the two groups, the two questions together. The question of multiculturalism versus biculturalism on the one hand, and the question of dissidence and Soviet-Canadian relations on the other hand. Links them together. And he does this partly to calm the Ukrainians so that the Kosygin visit will go smoothly. Okay. Now this is a picture of, then the next day after announcing this in Parliament, he flies to Winnipeg. Okay. This is a demonstration in Winnipeg, speaking in favor of the Soviet dissidents, in particular this one dissident called Valentin Moroz. It was probably familiar, the name is probably familiar to a lot of you. And these students are protesting, saying that the Prime Minister should speak to the Soviets about prisoners. And this gentleman here, this young student at the time, his name is Bozic, Yuri Bozic, was a spokesman for the students and approaches the Prime Minister, and Trudeau says, well, what do you want? And he says, well, we want you to speak to the Soviets about prisoners, political prisoners. And the Prime Minister says, well, I think I can do that, but only as a humanitarian gesture, and not as a political gesture. Well, it's better than nothing. So this is the agreement. And then later on, this is on, I believe this is on the steps of the Hotel Fort Garry in Winnipeg, the biggest CN hotel in Winnipeg. And he goes into the hotel, and there is a meeting. I think it's the Fort Garry meeting of Cook, and Trudeau speaks directly to the Ukrainian Canadian Committee, which is in the process of changing its name to Ukrainian Canadian Congress. This is October 8th, 1971. Trudeau contrived to warm Canada-Soviet relations while at the same time buying off Ukrainian-Canadian opposition to this policy by various concessions to the Ukrainian community in Canada, with an agreement to speak to the Soviets about political prisoners and proclaiming multiculturalism in a bilingual framework. So that's the compromise. Not biculturalism, but multiculturalism in a bilingual framework. Okay? And this is extremely important because the government accepts this policy. It's official policy of the government of Canada from that day on, and it still is today. And there's a picture of Trudeau speaking. You can see his hair is a bit long. He's balding, but his hair is still long at the back. There's Father Kushner again. There's a trezor. There's a sign. Cool. Well, the crowd goes wild. He's welcomed. They love it. They love him. He's going to speak to the Soviets. He's introduced multiculturalism. Sounds pretty good. And this is the headline in Canadian Farmer for that day. And there you can just barely see Trudeau there at the front speaking. And when he's finished his speech, Senator Paul Ussr'S, the Ukrainian member of the Senate, presents Trudeau formally with a copy of Ukrainian Concise Encyclopedia just published by the University of Toronto Press. And the Canadian farmer notes that so that he will know Ukraine better. Now there's some irony in that, eh? There's some irony. So he doesn't make such foolish statements about Norilsk and this sort of thing. Obviously, that's what it's all about. And that's Senator Ussr'S, and who is known to be the father of Canadian multiculturalism. Trudeau, who is also known to be the father of Canadian culturalism. I believe that they share this title with Yaroslav Hrushevsky to some degree from the B&D Commission. And that the two Ukrainians pushed for it hard, and Trudeau dragged his heels the whole way, kicking and screaming. He did it as a concession to the Ukrainians to get some relief on the eve of the Kosygin visit. Now Kosygin arrives in Canada. He speaks to Parliament, and some deals are made. And then he goes out of the Parliament from the House of Commons to the Senate. And in front of the Parliament of Canada, there are all kinds of crowds around him, protesters and everything. And a Hungarian protester jumps on top of Kosygin. This is world news. A protester jumps on top of Kosygin, tries to bring him to his knees. He sort of doesn't quite do it. And Trudeau is mad as hell, and the guy is hauled off. But that's how the visit starts. There are some pretty ferocious debates in the meetings with between Senator Ussr'S and Kosygin. And after this beginning, there's a number of demonstrations elsewhere in the country, especially in Toronto. Kosygin is going to speak to the Canadian Manufacturers Association in a building adjacent to the Science Center. And large crowds gather there to protest against Kosygin. And there are a lot of police there, including mounted police. And at one point they charge into the crowds. People are hurt, people go to the hospital, people are afraid, some people are arrested, later released. And Kosygin is forced pretty much. I'm sure he consulted Moscow. We don't know about this, but I think that he consulted Moscow and he said, look, this is crazy. We can't, they say Montreal's worse than Toronto. We can't go there. So he flies off to Cuba instead of going to Montreal. And this is an American take on it. There's Kosygin and Trudeau with shrapnel and all kinds of explosions all around them. And you can see Hungarian protest, Quebec separatist movement, air hijacking, Jewish protests. The Jews were very important in this. They were shouting, let our people go, let our people go, you know. In the left-hand corner, right up in the corner, minority squabbles, which I think is how the Americans interpret the debate over multiculturalism. So that's the Christian Science Monitor and the Kosygin catastrophe. Nevertheless, those agreements were signed. And this is a picture from Ottawa when they were signed. They're both quite happy about it. This is before the demonstration started. And as I said before, there were sporting, educational, and cultural exchanges. This was really good for the calming emotions during the Cold War. The most famous of these exchanges was the Canada-USSR hockey series of 1972. There was a series of hockey games across Canada, and then they went to Moscow for the final game, played the last game in Moscow. The Canadians won some games and the Soviets won more. The Soviets looked like they were going to win the series until they arrived in Moscow. That was a very tight game in Moscow. Kosygin was in the audience. Many Canadians flew into, hundreds of Canadians flew into Moscow for this game. It went to overtime. They were tied at overtime, and the Canadians began to chant, "Da, da, Canada, yes, Soviet." Well, Kosygin didn't like that. And he scowled, and it was noted in the newspapers. But anyhow, what happened was that in overtime, the first goal was scored by a Canadian by the name of Paul Henderson, and the Canadians win the series. So therefore, of course, capitalism is there. So that's the Canada-USSR hockey series. It's a major event in Canadian sporting history. Then in 1982, the multiculturalism movement continues until 1982. And Roy Romanow from Saskatchewan, Cook, of course, all the influential Ukrainians in Canada, but especially Roy Romanow, who was quite friendly with Jean Chrétien at that time. I forget what his ministry was, but he was handling the multiculturalism file. So the Uke and the Tuk were very famous for striking this deal. And they got it placed in the Constitution. Remember, Diefenbaker was criticized because that was statute law. Bill of Rights was statute law. Okay, you've got these rights now, but another government could come along and change it very easily by passing another statute. This was the Constitution of Canada. Next to impossible to change. Next to impossible. It's there, and it's in the section on Canadian rights and privileges. Charter of Rights is called. And again, Ukrainians are crucial in getting that into the Constitution. Well, Trudeau retires. The next important Prime Minister is Brian Mulroney. Brian, during his election campaign, says that he's going to change multiculturalism. He accepts multiculturalism, but he's going to change it a bit. The idea at the beginning was grants, financial grants to cultural organizations. And being a conservative, he wants to save money, and so he changes it from grants to appointing ethnics to government positions. And his first cabinet shows this quite clearly, because there are several East Europeans in this cabinet. The most prominent is Reina Tishon from Saskatchewan, who is his Minister of Justice, a very important file at that time. Don Mazinkowski from Alberta, who's a very charismatic minister. Jay Gepp from Manitoba, who's a Ruslander Mennonite from Ukraine, or his family is, and others as well. So Mulroney takes that tack and introduces a new era in the history of Ukrainians in Canada. And of course, as we all know, during his second term, at the beginning of his second term, he approaches Tishon and asks him if he would like to be Governor General of Canada. Tishon accepts, and he becomes the first Governor General of the Ukrainian background in our country. Now, by this time, the Soviets had entered a new and probably the last phase of their own history. It's the Gorbachev reforms, perestroika, glasnost, and loosening of the censorship everywhere. Ukraine falls a little bit behind some of the other republics. Lithuania seems to be leading the way. and rights are accorded to Lithuanians faster than in other republics, but Moscow is not too bad. But Hrushevsky is still in control. Eventually he's removed, he's replaced by somebody else. And at that time, Mulroney visits the Soviet Union, he goes to Ukraine. And this is one of his visits, together with members of the Ukrainian Canadian business community. And that's Bob Ussr'S there, here in Toronto, on one side of it, and that's Mykhailo Hrushevsky, who is of Serbian background, on the other side of him. Well, it's very good. Canadian relations with the Soviets are very good. And Canada is the first Western country to recognize Ukrainian independence in the winter of 1991. Only beat by Poland, which is next door neighbor and has already thrown off communism. But Canada is the first Western country, and a NATO country at that, to recognize Ukrainian independence. So relations are good, and that's pretty much how it ends. Yeah, that's all. So just to recap now, I think there are 2 or 3 important things that I said. First is that the Ukrainian identity is formed here in Canada, indigenously. It's not brought over from Europe. It's something that developed in Canada. The Ruthenians and the Galicians turned into Ukrainians in Canada, not in Europe. They were affected by events in Europe, but this happened here in this country. The second point that I made is one of the iconic events of the entire Cold War is September, October 1960 at the United Nations, where in response to Diefenbaker indirectly, because he's replying to a Philippine delegate who's repeating Diefenbaker's points, he goes berserk, he goes, palms his desk, all the Soviet delegation are palming their desks, the communists are from all of Eastern Europe. He takes off his shoe and he pounds it on his desk at the United Nations, the shoe incident. This is an important event in United Nations history. It never happened before, and it hasn't happened since. So that's the iconic event of the Cold War. Thirdly, multiculturalism in Canada was largely a product of Ukrainian efforts, the Ukrainian Canadian community. And it was all of the Ukrainian Canadian community, almost, because it involved the pioneer immigration, their children, their grandchildren. It involved the interwar immigration and their children. It involved the DP immigration and their children. So all 3 waves were involved in establishing multiculturalism in Canada. And they did it, not Trudeau. Trudeau was pushed into it, and his formula, multiculturalism in a bilingual framework, is the compromise that he gave them. Finally, Canada is the first Western nation to recognize Ukrainian independence. Thank you very much, students.
Thank you very much. Quite a survey with a lot of kind details. Questions, питання по-англійському, по-українському.
You mentioned the Ukrainian communists that were active back in probably until the 60s or 70s.
I'm sorry, I can't hear
So
you.
you mentioned about the Ukrainian communists.
Yes.
And how long were they active, and are they still active?
That's a simple question, but the answer is really long. They were most active and most successful in the 1930s and during the second phase of the Second World War. During the second phase of the Second World War, I believe, was their heyday. They were allies of the Canadian government. The government was protecting them from attacks from the nationalists. The government returned some of their halls to them, compensated them to some degree, slowly let their leaders out of internment, and they enjoyed very high prestige in Canadians. As I mentioned, Joseph Stalin was not the terrible dictator, he was Uncle Joe, right? So that was their heyday. Everything changed with Gluzenko and the outbreak of the Cold War. They began to lose members. but not in a big way. These are dedicated people, most of them, and the young children had grown up in the halls with Ukrainian dancing and song and all this sort of thing. So for them, it was also a cultural thing. It wasn't purely political. And it was part of their identity. And so they're fiercely loyal to it. That lasted pretty much until 1956. 1956 was a shock to see that there's a revolution against communism. So after 56, they began to lose members in a serious way. And then 2 decades later comes Czechoslovakia. Socialism with a human face, Alexander Dubček. And the same thing happens, only a much greater scale. And key members leave the Communist Party of Canada at that time, and some of them leave the Labour Temple as well. Well, they usually go together. Remember, the membership of the Labour Temples was not all Communist Party members. Only a small part of the Labour Temples were members of the party. Most of them were cultural enthusiasts and that sort of thing. And people who had serious questions about whether our system was all that good, because remember, during the Depression, it was very hard, especially out west with the Dust Bowl and all that sort of thing. So communism, until it was far away, they didn't know exactly what was going on, but it was very hopeful. So some of them put their hopes in that. You know, that lasts until 1968. 68, the image is shattered. Here's a guy who seemed to be loyal to socialism, trying to make it work, and he's crushed by Soviet tanks and arrested. And kind of an almost neo-Stalinist regime is installed in Czechoslovakia. Well, key members leave the Communist Party at that time. And the youth within the Labour Temples begin to have serious questions. They're better educated now. And so they lose members as well. Since then, they've been losing members steadily. The collapse of the Soviet Union was the death knell, I think, of the organization. They subsisted partly selling Ukrainian artifacts and books and things like Ussr'S Ukrainian and that type of thing, or organizing tours to the Soviet Union, family reunification, this type of things. They were so they're useful in that way, but it only went so far, and they lost their funding with the collapse of the Soviet Union because private businesses, all kinds, stepped in to take over. So I think they've lost most of their influence since then. There are still, the organization still exists. There are people who are, you know, they have a insurance wing, and there are people who are retired and have invested money in that insurance. I think it's called the Workers' Benevolent Association, something like that. And they have an old folks home in Winnipeg, just like we have here in Toronto. Ours is nationalist and theirs is not. So yeah, so that's the situation pretty much now. I think that there's still Russian influence within the organization, what's left of it. That's pretty considerable. But I don't think it's entirely open. So it's a question about how far that goes, and I don't know, I can't comment on it.
What prompted Trudeau to try to warm up to the Soviets? I know you also visited Cuba.
Yes.
Castro was behind.
Yes, he was friendly. He was friendly to Castro. In the 1950s, he visited Red China, as it was called at the time, when Mao was in his prime, at a time when 40 million people were starving to death in the Great Chinese Famine, and he didn't notice it. This is not that surprising, really, because people visited Soviet Ukraine in the 1930s and didn't notice it. People who were ideologically blinkered, you know. I know people in the from the 1970s and 80s who visited the Soviet Union and didn't see anything wrong. You know, so this happens, ideological blinkers, you know. So Trudeau visited the Soviet Union. We could talk about China too and Castro, but let's talk about the Soviet Union because that's our subject today. When Trudeau visited in the 1950s, he was there on some kind of a peace conference. And he met this wife of an American diplomat there. And they had a conversation. She said, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, I'm Pierre Trudeau and I'm from Canada." And so she said, "Well, what are you doing here?" Well, he replied, and I quote from the source that I got, "I am a communist and a Catholic. I am a communist and a Catholic." And you might not believe it from what I've said today, but he was a Catholic. And he retreated to a monastery in Quebec almost every summer, where he communed with the higher power, and was devout in his own way. You know, exactly what his philosophy was in this regard, I don't think there's much of a literature on it, but it should be investigated, you know, and how he joined the two together, you know, is a very interesting kind of question. So that's Pierre Trudeau, you know. He was in some ways flawed, but a very great man who changed the country greatly and solved some very serious problems. Being Ukrainians, we know that he didn't see all the problems the same way we see them, but he did what he could. He thought he was defusing serious questions that threatened civilization, and he wanted to improve relations with the communist bloc. Remember, Vietnam was still very hot at that time. People were being killed every single day, just as they are now. And nobody knew what to do about it. And he had this idea of somehow diplomatically defusing the Cold War. And he wasn't alone, because Nixon had his strategy at that time, parallel to Trudeau's. And Nixon and Kissinger were making up with China for a different reason. They wanted to isolate the Soviet Union, but still they were making up with China. So they had different reasons, but the same goal was to quiet international relations. And remember, in Europe, don't forget, Europe is going through something similar too, with the Ostpolitik and Willy Brandt and all of this, you know. And this is the stage further after the early 60s, when Kennedy goes to Berlin and says, "Ich bin ein Berliner," remember? Well, that's, you know, pretty hot stuff. And then afterwards, Willy Brandt tries to calm things down, accepts the new boundaries in Europe. The Polish boundaries were disputed up to that time. He accepts them when he's chancellor. So this is going on all over the world. Trudeau is not isolated. Trudeau is paralleled by Kissinger and Nixon and by Willy Brandt in Europe. And we're part of that. We're part of that. Sort of the subsection.
Just curious, this whole concept of multiculturalism, did that help ease the tension between the Poles and the Ukrainians? Is that a factor in or has it even eased?
Do you mean in Canada, or do you mean in Europe?
Canada or Europe? Well, Poles are very cooperative with Ukrainians right now, as they understand.
I can say that at the same time that Yaroslav Rudnitsky was active, there was a Polish senator, and Senator Usyk for the Ukrainians. There was a Polish senator named Stanley, what was his name? Hajdasz. And they got along quite well, the two of them. Hajdasz was a liberal. Poles tended to vote liberal here in Toronto. Ukrainians tended to vote conservative. But the conservative senator, Usyk, got along very well with Stanley Hajdasz. So there were some alliances formed. And I recall, I think it was 1977, there was a great conference in Hamilton, Polish-Ukrainian conference, academic conference, at which high-powered scholars came from all over the world, Polish, Ukrainian, from Poland itself, from the United States, Canada, from Western Europe, Polish emigres in Western Europe, the highest caliber cultural scholars, and spoke at that conference. It was a very, very emotional conference, and a lot of good feelings came out of it. So yeah, I think that that was going on at the time, and multiculturalism was part of the backdrop to that, I think. Haidash was a strong supporter of multiculturalism, just as Usyk was.
Thank you. That was quite the overview of Canadian relations with Ukraine, Ukrainian community with the government. Something that I didn't hear you speak about, I'd be interested in your view, the regional dimension of Ukrainian communities in Canada. Because you spoke about Ukrainians in Canada as if they were a monolithic whole, and they're not. So how important is that? And again, I don't know, that's probably a long question, so perhaps just like a brief answer.
Sure, sure. No, I did approach that indirectly by referring to the waves of immigration. The third wave is primarily DP, right? And they have a certain political profile, different from the Ukrainian-Canadian profile that preceded it. As far as geographic regions, this is very clear, especially in the question of multiculturalism, because multiculturalism was interpreted differently in Toronto and Eastern Canada than it was in Western Canada. In Western Canada, you know, as I mentioned, the language was suppressed during the First World War. Okay, they never recovered from that. Thousands of people had their citizenship taken away. You know, thousands of people were imprisoned in camps. Certain people, some people had voting rights, were deprived of voting rights, and those voting rights were taken away from the men and given to the wives and daughters of serving soldiers who were mostly English. Okay, so all that's going on, it has a tremendous psychological effect on the Ukrainians in Canada, tremendous. And there's, I would say, a very serious emotional attitude towards the English Canadian elite thereafter. The kind of Pochachab Menchavartnosti, you know, this type of thing. So that's very deep out west. And so the fight for multiculturalism is interpreted in the West as a cultural fight to get their status back in Canadian society, to raise the level of respect in Canadian society so that Ukrainians were respected the same as everybody else. Because those first two waves of immigrants were terribly discriminated against. You know, to have a foreign name in the eyes of the English was a bad thing. It was hard to get a job. Members of my family could not get a job at Eaton's or the Bay because they had a Ukrainian name. They pretended to have an English name, applied for the same job down the street, and got it. Okay? This was not an isolated incident. This was everywhere. So multiculturalism in Western Canada was interpreted as salve to heal those wounds and raise the prestige of Ukrainians in society. Okay. In Eastern Canada, and particularly Toronto, was dominated by the DPs. And they had a different mindset. And their children, even today, still have a different mindset from the children out west, I would say. And that mindset had to do with the Cold War, with liberating Ukraine, with suppression of Ukrainian culture in the Soviet Union, and building a free Ukraine here in Canada. And the attitude was, well, we can't do it directly, we can build a free Ukraine here in Canada, and then maybe one day we can go back and help them out. Okay. So that's the attitude here. It doesn't exist to the same extent out west, not at all. You know. So that's the regional, the major regional divide among Ukrainians in Canada, I would say. And it goes along with the wave of immigration. And then the next wave, you know, after 1991, don't understand the DPs, you know. And the next, with this war now, they don't understand anybody who came before. And they never heard of any of these things. So, you know, there's a lot of learning to do for all of us.
Ще якісь питання? Дуже дякуємо вам, пане
Дякую
доктор
вам.
Приймак, за вашу. Дякую всім, що прийшли, і запрошуємо на наступну доповідь, яка відбудеться 9 травня. Доповідачем буде доктор Юрій Мончак з Монреалю. Дякую.
Я би попросила членів дирекції. Членів дирекції